Hello, and welcome to week 4 of Biblical Exegesis Practicum Online with Life Pacific University. I just want to say thank you to you guys for the last week, extending me some grace. It's a difficult couple of weeks for me and my family, so just really appreciate that. Did want to catch you up with where we're at as far as the worksheet is concerned on poetry. Just wanted to talk through the poetry worksheet a little bit, kind of debrief a little bit with you. So for the observations, you guys are doing pretty well with those. Again, just want to make sure that we are getting detailed there. Right, you want to read and read and read. Read until the word "the" looks like it's misspelled. Right, and just try to pick stuff out. Kind of like in the Exodus project, we notice immediately that God talks about his deliverance before he talks about his expectations, those kinds of things. So we want to try to look for those sorts of things. Okay, I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail here in a second when we look through Jonah in particular. Um, for the intertextuality, this gives us an okay look at observations. I think what you can see looking at Exodus 34 5 to 9 and how it's used throughout the rest of the Old Testament is that it's used almost exclusively in a positive context. This is God's self-declaration of who he is, and that is pretty consistent throughout the entire Old Testament. In sharp contrast with that, Jonah is not using it positively. Jonah is almost throwing it back in God's face. And this to me is sort of an interpretive key in the book, that when we start to read the book again with that in mind, we start to see that Jonah is not a positive character. And this is, to me, I think, a really important part of this particular book. We tend to read Jonah in a positive light because we assume that a prophet is going to be a positive character. And you can see this a little bit in the paper that I assigned for you to read. That Jonah is what I call an anti-prophet. That he does what we would expect the audience to do, not what we would expect the prophet to do. Um, and so, as we read the book, hopefully that comes out for you. Let's take a look at Jonah. Um, the word of Yahweh was to Jonah, son of Amittai, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and cry upon her, because her evil has come up before me." I mentioned arise, go, and cry are three prophetic imperatives here. Whenever you have God telling someone to do something in a narrative, you should take note of specifically what God has told them to do so that you can take note of whether or not they've done it. Um, this is really important because often what you will get is partial obedience, and partial obedience is disobedience, right? Delayed obedience is disobedience, and so we have to be really careful when we notice that kind of stuff, right? Jonah arose. We have partial obedience here, and fled to Tarshish from the face of Yahweh. He went down to Joppa and found a ship, and so we start to see him going down instead of coming up, and we have a distinction here where evil has come up before Yahweh and Jonah is going down, and we'll notice throughout the book he continues to go down and down and down. He goes to the ship, going to Tarshish, he gives payment and went down into it to go with him to Tarshish. But Yahweh threw a great wind at the sea, and it was a great storm on the sea, and the ship was planning to violently break. Now, this is an odd anthropomorphism, which means that we are giving human characteristics to something that is not human. But the reason for this is that this is literally what it says in Hebrew, and this is a clue in the book of Jonah that it seems like everyone is responding to Yahweh except for Jonah. Even the ship is actually considering actions in response to what Yahweh has done, and Jonah is not. So the sailors were afraid, and each man called to his God, and they threw everything in the boat at the sea. Now I have this italicized because I want you to see "at the sea" here. I probably could have made that more apparent, but I've got a footnote here for you. It's worth noting the same syntax is used for the sailor's response to the storm that is used of Yahweh's production of the storm. And so it seems like the sailors are more like Yahweh than Jonah. And so that's why that's italicized. Then again, Jonah goes down to the recesses of the vessel and lays down and goes to sheep, and goes to sleep. Uh, the chief sailor came near and said to him, "Why are you sleeping? Arise and cry." Again, here we have the prophetic imperatives. And so we have a pagan sailor telling the prophet of God to do what his God has told him to do. Perhaps that God will consider us and we will not perish. This is a little bit of an interpretive translation because the word that isn't there, but it is, instead of Elohim, it is Ha Elohim, which is literally the God. But it seems like, from a pagan's perspective, I could see this being that God as opposed to God. Um, Especially in light of the fact that he's saying to your God. Perhaps that God will consider us. And each man said to his companion, "Let us go and cast lots and see on whose account this evil is happening to us." And they cast lots, and the lot fell upon Jonah. And they said to him, "Please tell us on account of what or who this evil is happening to us. What is your profession? From where do you come? What is your land, and where are your people?" And he said to them, "I'm a Hebrew. Yahweh, the God of heavens, is who I fear." I've translated it this way to indicate the intensity of the syntax in Hebrew here. The one who made the sea and the dry ground. And the men feared a great fear, and they said to him, "Why have you done this?" And they said this because the men knew that he was fleeing from the face of Yahweh, because he had told them. And this is another place, this is the first place in the book where we have a reference to something from earlier in the story that we haven't actually heard. We didn't know that Jonah told them this. And this is going to happen a few times in the story where we find out something after it happens and it wasn't mentioned when it was happening, which is kind of interesting. "Why have you done this?" Because he had told them. And they said to him, "What shall we do to you that the seas would be calm around us?" They said this because the sea was moving and tossing. And again, we have part of the prophetic imperatives here that moving is the sea is obeying the prophetic imperatives when Jonah is not. He said to them, "Lift me and throw me at the sea." And so there's some irony here, because he's actually telling the sailors to mirror Yahweh's actions of throwing things at the sea instead of throwing himself at the sea. But the men forcibly rowed to return back to land, but they were not able to do so because the sea was moving and tossing around them. And they cried out, again, prophetic imperative, to Yahweh and said, "Please, Yahweh, do not let us perish on the account of the soul of this man, and do not charge us with innocent blood, because you, Yahweh, have done as you please." And they lifted Jonah and threw him at the sea. And the sea stood still from its storming, and the men feared a great fear to Yahweh. And they made sacrifices to Yahweh and vowed vows. Yahweh decided a fish to swallow Jonah, so Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And you notice here in the footnote that 3 days and 3 nights indicated a trip to the underworld. And so there's a lot here that perhaps is being indicated by Jonah going to the underworld in the fish. Perhaps the fish is trying to take him to the underworld. Perhaps the fish is considered the underworld. A lot of different things to consider there. Then Jonah prayed to Yahweh, his God, from the belly of the fish and said, "I cried out from the distress that was imposed on me to Yahweh, and he answered me." Now notice, "I cried out" there. That is the beginning of the prophetic imperatives, right? And so we have arise, go, and cry, and "I cried out" is that third prophetic imperative. So it sounds like almost he's starting out correctly, but then we rapidly see that he is not. Um, and from the belly of Sheol I called for help. Sheol is the underworld in the Old Testament. And you heard my voice, but you had thrown me to the depths in the heart of the sea, and the current surrounded me. All your breakers and waves were upon me, passing over me. But I myself said, I was driven out from in front of you and your eyes, yet I will again look to your holy temple. The waters covered up to my soul, and the deep surrounded me. The reeds were bound to my head. To the base of the mountain I went down. The earth, her bars were separated from me forever. But you brought my life up from the pit, Yahweh my God. While my soul was severely fainting upon me, I remembered Yahweh, and to you my prayer came to your holy temple. While guarding vain idols, faithfulness they abandon, but I, in a voice of thanksgiving, I will sacrifice to you. That which I have vowed I will repay. Salvation belongs to Yahweh. So Yahweh spoke to the fish, and he spit Jonah to the dry ground. Now, in this poem, several of you mentioned that Jonah repents. But I want to point out here, we don't actually at any point have Jonah explicitly repenting. In fact, if you count the pronouns, he refers to himself, I think, 11 times, and I think he refers to Yahweh 3 times, 4 times, something like that. He very clearly is emphasizing himself in this prayer. And the more we read the rest of the book, the more that we can appreciate how incredibly selfish this prayer is. Now, I won't go into the great detail of it. You have the paper that I wrote, but in the poem itself, you have several passages from the Psalms that Jonah is using that help us to see how he is using the language of the Psalms in his prayer, which helps to illustrate for us how he is not repenting. So, picking up in 3 verse 1, and the word of the Yahweh was to Jonah a second time, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and cry to her the message which I myself will speak to you. And literally, this is the crying. He repeats the same word, sort of for emphasis. And Jonah arose and he went. And so we have 2 of the 3 being obeyed here. According to the word of Yahweh, Nineveh was a great city to God, a 3-day walk. But Jonah began to go into the city a day's walk, and he cried out. So notice that the city is 3 days walk. That probably means it's 3 days walk across. That's how big it is. It's talking about it being a great city to God. It's probably talking about it take 3 days to walk across it. And Jonah walks in a day, so he doesn't even get to the city center. He cries out, and he says, Yet 40 days and Nineveh will be overturned. And notice here, no call for repentance. It doesn't say, Yet 40 days and Nineveh will be overturned, unless, right? Just says, Yet 40 days and Nineveh will be overturned. Then the men of Nineveh trusted. This is the same root as Amittai, so we have some irony here too. Jonah does not exemplify faithfulness, but the Ninevites respond to his insufficient preaching. So they trust God, and they called a fast and put on sackcloth from the greatest to the least. And the word reached the king of Nineveh, and he arose from his seat, removed his cloak from upon him, and covered himself in sackcloth and sat upon ashes. And he called out and said, In Nineveh, from the judgment of the king and his elders, saying, Man and beast, cow and cattle, they will not taste anything, they will not graze or taste water, and they will be covered in sackcloth, both man and beast, and they will vehemently cry to God. And they will turn each man from his own evil and from the violence which is in their hands. Who knows, perhaps this God will turn and relent and turn back from the burning anger of his nostril, and we will not perish. And the anger of the nostril here, that is just a literal rendering. That's how they indicated anger in the ancient world, as flaring nostrils. And so that's just how it's said there. And this God, I translate it this way because that's how it's phrased in Hebrew. It seems like it's saying the generic God, which is Yahweh, of course, but it's saying that even in their generic plea, that God responded to them as the generic God instead of responding to them as Yahweh, which I think is interesting. And this God saw their work, that they turned from their evil way, and this God relented concerning evil, which he said he would do to them, and he did not do it. But it was evil to Jonah, great evil, and he kindled anger to himself, and he prayed to Yahweh, saying, Please, Yahweh, is this not what I said, even living in my own land? For this reason I confronted you to flee to Tarshish, because I knew you are a God gracious and compassionate, long of nose, and abounding in faithfulness, and relenting concerning evil. And here we have him saying, Is this not what I said in my own land, and that I confronted you? None of that shows up in Jonah chapter 1. And so again, we have something happening earlier in the book, but not being recorded, and then being referred to later, which is interesting. And so here he is throwing this back in God's face derisively. This is not a positive thing. He's saying, I knew you would forgive them. And the context of Exodus 34 is Yahweh is forgiving the Israelites for the golden calf. And so Jonah seems to be using this to say, you are only supposed to be forgiving Israel. You are not supposed to be forgiving anyone else. That seems to be the context that he's trying to pull in here, which really is quite a thing. He's essentially saying that Yahweh is cheating on Israel, right? Then verse 3, now Yahweh, please take my soul away from me, because it is better for me to die than to remain alive. And Yahweh said, are you right to burn anger to yourself? This to me is probably the most fatherly thing in all of Scripture. That Jonah is throwing a tantrum, and God just sort of waits him out and says, you okay? You all right now? You feel better? I mean, this is what I do with my kids, right? You watch them just kind of lose it, and then you say, it's okay, it's okay. All right, you feel better now? Is it not in a condescending or a rude way, but just like, are we done? Are we okay? And I don't know, just that strikes me as just a beautiful thing in Scripture, that God sees this derisive tantrum that is probably one of the most disrespectful things anyone has ever said to God. He forgives, and that's bad somehow. um, and he just takes it. He just takes it. You know. And then verse 5, but Jonah went from the city and sat in the east of the city and made himself there a booth. Sukkot is the Hebrew word for booth, and this is a festival, the festival of booths. And this celebration is intended to remind Israel that they rely on Yahweh's providence. And it's now being used by a prophet who would withhold that providence from his enemies. And so it's really ironic, especially since the command to celebrate Sukkot comes very closely after Exodus 34. And so him creating for himself a booth here is really ironic. He sits underneath it in the shade and waits to see what would happen to the city. And Yahweh God, which is the first time that we have these words put together, Elohim Yahweh, or Yahweh Elohim. And Yahweh God appointed a gourd, and it went up above Jonah to be shade on his head to deliver him from his evil. And Jonah rejoiced concerning the gourd, a great rejoicing. But this God appointed a worm when dawn came, and it ate the gourd, and it shriveled. But it was as the sun rose that God appointed a hot east wind, and the sun ate at Jonah's head, and he became tired. And he asked his soul to die, and said, it is better that I die than I remain alive. And God said to Jonah, are you right to burn anger to yourself concerning the gourd? And he said, I am right to burn anger to myself until death. And Yahweh said to him, you pity the gourd which you did not toil for, and you did not make great. It was born in the night and was destroyed the next night. But I'm not supposed to have compassion on Nineveh, the great city. In it are as many as 120,000 men who do not know between their right and left hand, not to mention many animals. And the point here, in ending with a question, I think, is the book of Jonah is really trying to force its audience to ask, are you Jonah? Jonah's responding to the Ninevites because they're terrible people, and he doesn't want them forgiven. And we all have people in our lives that have hurt us, that we want bad things to happen to them. And we may not admit it outwardly, but inside there are people that have hurt us that we think, I want God's justice on that person. And that's not necessarily wrong. There's a place for justice. There's a place for vengeance, but it's the Lord's. The Lord decides that, not us. And so when God extends grace to people, even if the grace is towards people who are our enemies, we should rejoice, because God has been gracious to us. He's being gracious to them. And so the book here isn't, it really is quite an ironic book in a lot of different ways. It doesn't record much of what Jonah says to the Ninevites. It doesn't record much of his prophesying, and perhaps this is all he actually said, is yet 40 days and Nineveh will be overturned. It focuses on the prophet, which none of the other prophetic material really does, and focuses on his failures, and really juxtaposes that against the sailors and the fish and the boat and the gourd and the worm and the Ninevites, even, who all are responding to Yahweh when Jonah will not. And that's really the point of this book. Um, I'm hoping that this kind of shores things up for you a little bit, so that you can appreciate what's going on in Jonah, and maybe kind of see where you could have pulled some other things out, or uh, the assignment would have made a little bit more sense to you in light of this. I'm probably going to curve those assignments a little bit, just because I didn't get any lecture videos to you last week. And so that way you guys will all get a little bit of a boost out of that. Again, I really appreciate all of you giving me the grace that you did last week. And hopefully we will be on target moving forward from here. So thank you so much.